Hello and welcome. I'm Ramesh Ramachandran and you're watching a special broadcast here on DD India. Now, 3rd March was Super Tuesday in the United States, the day 14 provinces went to the polls to elect the Democratic Party's candidate who could go on to challenge Donald Trump in the November presidential election. Two very special guests join me in the studio to help you, the viewer, understand the Super Tuesday results so that you know what it takes to be on top of the news. Let me introduce them to you. I have with me Ambassador Arun K. Singh. He is a former Indian ambassador to the United States, France and Israel. Also joining me in the studio is Professor K.P. Vijayalakshmi from the Jawaharlal Nehru University. Ambassador Singh and Professor Vijayalakshmi, welcome to DD India. Good to have you on the show. But before I come to you, I want to bring our viewers up to speed on the news so far. Now, the race to win the Democratic presidential nomination in the U.S. has narrowed down to a two-horse race. Former Vice President Joe Biden and sitting lawmaker Bernie Sanders clinched major victories during the Super Tuesday primaries, the most important day in the fight for the White House.
Our campaign reflects the diversity of this party and this nation, and that's how it should be, because we need to bring everybody along, everybody. We want a nominee who will beat Donald Trump, but also keep Nancy Pelosi the Speaker of the House. Win back the United States Senate. If that's what you want, join us.
Now, Super Tuesday was held in 14 states, including Alabama, Arkansas, California, Colorado, Maine, Massachusetts, Minnesota, North Carolina, Oklahoma, Tennessee, Texas, Utah, Vermont, and Virginia. Now, Biden grabbed Virginia, North Carolina, Alabama, Oklahoma, Tennessee, Minnesota, Massachusetts, and Arkansas, propelling him as the frontrunner in the primaries, a remarkable turnaround in his electoral fortunes.
Tonight, I tell you with absolute confidence, we are going to win the Democratic nomination, and we are going to defeat the most dangerous president in the history of this country.
But Sanders, by winning big in California, which sends 415 delegates, signaled that his fight to win the Democratic nomination and challenge Republican incumbent Donald Trump was not over yet. Sanders also won his home state of Vermont in addition to Utah and Colorado. But it is virtually curtains for Massachusetts lawmaker Eleizabeth Warren after she badly lost her own home state to Biden. Former New York Mayor Micheal Bloomber, a late entrant to the race who has already spent $500 million on his campaign so far, too failed to make a dent as he won the American Samoa caucus. And lawmaker Tulsi Gabba, the first Hindu to enter the lower chamber of U.S. legislature and whose presidential ambition has failed to take off, won her first pledged delegate in American Samoa as well. All right, if I can come to my guests now for the discussion on Super Tuesday. Ambassador Singh, your thoughts on the results so far. Biden winning 10 of those 14 seats and Sanders only 4. So as some people say, is Joe-mentum on Biden's side?
Today was clearly a very dramatic day in terms of the outcome of the Democratic primaries, because in the elections held so far, except in South Carolina, which preceded the Super Tuesday elections, right, Joe Biden had not done so well. And people were wondering, in fact, in most of the races, he was 3rd, 4th, or even lower. So people were really beginning to wonder whether his campaign was fizzling out, he was not raising enough funding for the campaign, and whether the message that he was trying to send across was attracting the voter or not. So the change came in South Carolina. Right. And it came because a very prominent Democrat congressman, Jim Clyburn, who is really number 3 in the Democratic Party in the U.S. House, he endorsed Joe Biden. So that was a prominent African-American endorsement for Joe Biden, because it was assessed that Joe Biden could get a momentum if it was clear that the African-American vote was going to line up behind him. Right. With that endorsement, he got South Carolina. And in fact, many people have commented that the Jim Clyburn endorsement for Joe Biden was like Ted Kennedy's endorsement of President Obama's campaign in 2016, because that was a signal that the mainstream Democratic establishment establishment in 2008, that was the mainstream Democratic establishment was going to welcome the first African-American nominee for president in American history. So with that, a major shift came towards President Obama's campaign. So that was a signal that the African-American vote would probably go with Joe Biden. It happens in South Carolina. That gave him the momentum in going into the Super Tuesday. And with the votes today, he lost California, which is an important signal because California is seen as a very important left or center bastion, a liberal bastion in US politics. So that went with Bernie Sanders. But Joe Biden won Texas, which is the second largest in size in terms of delegates. But he also won Okhlahama and Arkansas, which was the signal that the white working class vote was now moving towards Joe Biden. So when they line up against President Trump, who attracted the white working class vote in the 2016 election, this would be a major signal that beyond the African American, the white working class is also looking at Joe Biden. So with Joe Biden's very good performance in the Super Tuesday primaries, there will be a sense that the mainstream Democratic establishment is coming back a bit on its own in these elections, and perhaps now two candidates will emerge eventually, Bernie Sanders on one side, Joe Biden on the other. And it is reminding me very much of the 2016 campaign, and I happened to be in the United States at that time. I was assigned there and I was watching the campaign. I had also gone to the Democratic Convention, and there was really a battle between Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton, one representing the left of center in US Democratic politics and the other mainstream in Democratic establishment. And that was a very, very bitter fight. And Bernie Sanders, his followers had a sense that they were not given full scope by the Democratic establishment. And even at the convention was divided. And Hillary Clinton could not quite get the support of Bernie Sanders supporters who booed her during the convention itself. So one can see that while the Democratic mainstream is coming into its own, unless Joe Biden is able to reach out in some way to Bernie Sanders or his supporters, the Democratic Party may remain split as it goes into the convention or even into the elections after that.
Indeed. Professor Vijay Lakshmi, clearly the Biden swept the South, the African-American vote, and the suburban whites seem to have voted for Biden with a vengeance. So are you at all surprised by the results?
Well, no, not really, because there are three factors I would say are very largely in play. One is the demographics, the other is the regions, and third is party loyalty, you know. So if you put it together, one could have predicted to some extent that this would become a two-horse race. And of course, I think the extras are what I would call as the external variables, where the endorsement by Senator Klobuchar and also by Pete Buttigieg. So I think in that sense, you are gathering more support, not just in terms of the delegate, you know, that you're trying to get through the primaries that you're fighting, but you're also building up a broad-based support for the post-November fight that would actually pit you against the Republican nominee. So I think in that sense, this is to some level expected, but this fight could go on. That's what I feel, you know, though this has been seen as a very strong showing by former Vice President Biden. The fact is you need about 1,000 odd delegates because the total number of delegates is about 3,000. So there's a lot of delegates still at play, and we do say that Super Tuesday is in some ways a disservice to the other states. Because, you know, it's not as if the other states don't matter. They do. After all, you know, at the end, there is an electoral college yet at play in the actual presidential elections. This is only a fight for a party nomination. And the primaries came in 1900s because of the corruption in the party bosses and the state bosses and the party establishment, which Ambassador Singh was talking about. And I think in some ways, Bernie Bernie Sanders and other candidates who support him, lawmakers who support him, have constantly started saying that the establishment is not in touch with the grassroots feelings and grassroots individual preferences, and so during the convention maybe they'll make another play. So there is another new, one more expectation, as it were, is will there be a brokered convention? Will there be a brokering at that time by the party bigwigs and the establishment and the so-called revolutionaries, if you like, or the Turks within the party? So I think all of these are at play. But at the moment, I think Bernie Sanders still remains a potent challenge for any final outcome for the nomination. He still remains a potent challenge.
And Brother Singh, just to take off on the point where Professor left, what's your take on Bernie Sanders? Is he, for instance, as some call him, too far left for some people's comfort? He describes himself as a democratic socialist. He speaks for a bigger government, Medicare for all from the government, and less of private insurance. There's a youth surge in favor of Bernie Sanders, and he's been able to generate funds for both 2016 and now the elections in 2020. So what makes Sanders stick?
He has clearly captured the imagination of a segment of the US voter, a segment of the Democratic voter. And he's doing this second time around, so it's not a fluke. He did that in the 2016 campaign, and he's repeating that now. And the other interesting dimension is that although he himself is quite advanced in age, he has enthused the younger workers in the Democratic Party. Therefore, the young who are idealistic, who are looking to their future, who want things to be done differently, who want to bring in more idealism and morality into politics, they are enthused by the message that Bernie Sanders brings to the table. And then he has brought up certain issues like Medicare for all, so that everybody gets good healthcare facility. Because in the US, healthcare is extremely expensive. He has spoken about making higher education free. And in the US, again, universities, colleges are extremely expensive. And students get into huge debts before they start working. So these are important messages that is brought to the table. Now, in the US system for a long time, if you're called a liberal or if you're called a socialist, that was almost seen as an abuse. And people didn't want to go by that nomenclature. He's been upfront. He doesn't mind being labeled as such. So obviously there is a certain sentiment that he has captured. And again, if you look at the Democratic Party in the US Congress, there is a very strong left of center segment within the Democratic Party, led by Alexandra Cortez, there's Pramila Jayapal, many others who are exercising tremendous influence and pressure on Nancy Pelosi, who is the speaker, whom Joe Biden spoke about very, very positively, who represents the more mainstream establishment. So there is a battle for ideas. Bernie Sanders represents a very strong segment of that battle for ideas. And I'm sure he wants to take that forward. And I think he sees his mission not just as fighting for the presidency or the presidential elections, but fighting for the idea that he believes it and try to mainstream it within the Democratic articulation and broader US articulation.
Indeed. Professor Vijayalakshmi, how would you compare or contrast the Biden campaign with that of Sanders? How do you look at Biden's middle-of-the-road approach? Does it stand him in good stead between now and July when the convention takes place? And also, does the Biden campaign have it in it to dispel the charges that Trump might level if he becomes the frontrunner on the Ukraine scandal, the Burisma scandal? So is Biden prepared to take on Trump with all he's got?
I think so, because, you know, for him to have persisted despite the narrowing of lead before the Super Tuesday, and despite a number of stories appearing about, you know, his viability and the way that Sanders' campaign was actually able to not just narrow down but overtake Biden campaign. So the persistence, in fact, reveals that Biden has a thorough grasp of the Democratic Party machine, and he's also an experienced politician. Indeed. In terms of being not just the vice president. His politics has been, you know, of many, many years. So I think he's there for the long haul, and that's why the campaign did not look very, you know, tentative or faltering. They kept saying, okay, we'll see, because they had this understanding and has been proved right that the African American votes would in fact choose Biden, and that came true for them. But it's also true that the affluent also and the college educated, for example, Okhlahama, you mentioned Okhlahama. A number of analysis about Okhlahama reveals that even these people want a moderate a Democrat and a person who can in fact take the democratic way, you know, or the ideals of Democratic Party. And the problem with Sanders' campaign and Sanders' choice of issues, while they are very welcome and they have in fact ignited a number of young as well as old people, the fact is that the question of payment, who would pay, how would we pay for these things, those are deeper issues that would come up, not at this stage perhaps, but it would be something that, you know, if it goes further in the next 2-3 contests that we will see for the Democratic Party, this will become a big question. How will you pay for it? Hope is not a plan. Right? Absolutely. So you have to just say how would you pay? And secondly, even education. There is a certain amount of, you know, insistence on free schooling and free college. Now, free schooling already exists to some extent in the United States. But if you want the pre-KG also to be free, and then also pay for childcare, which Hillary Clinton, that's all part of the Democratic political messaging. So I think, you know, there is a certain amount of there are some issues that are still out there which will become sharply delineated as we get to the, you know, closure of the final nomination contest. But there are many states in play as well. And the other question that you did raise was, how would Biden face Trump? Well, he's been facing it all along. So in many ways, this win from now to July or June, I suppose, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, they're meeting. I think the campaign and Biden staff are going to be sharpening their arsenal, if you like, on how better or how best to deflect further attacks. Because even earlier, the fact that President Trump had actually given this attack, even when he first began his candidacy, has given them ample time to, you know, actually build a formidable rebuttals and campaigns. So that's what I think will happen.
Sure, fair point. Ambassador Singh, help our viewers understand the big issue for the average Democratic voter in the US today. Is it the economy? Is it healthcare? Or is it Trump? Or all three?
I think it's all three. At one level, as President Trump has been arguing, the economy is doing reasonably well. It has grown at an average of 2.5–3% during the 3 years of his presidency. The unemployment rates have come down to historic low levels. Inflation rates have been under check. So at one level, the economic performance has been good. Right. President Trump has wanted to claim that that is on account of the fact that he has brought about deregulation, cut down on restrictions in a number of industry, and that with his trade disruptive measures that he has undertaken and imposing tariffs on imports from many other countries, large number of industries have moved to the US, and therefore all that is happening. Democrats would argue that this is only marginal and that much of the change has been because of the policies that were adopted during the Obama administration. Now, that having been said, there are many other issues related to the economy in terms of the wages of workers, in terms of healthcare benefits, in terms of education expenses that the Democrats focus on. So those are certainly one set of issues. But they have a lot of concerns with what they see as the social policies brought in under the Trump administration in terms of approach to immigrants, building a wall along the Mexican border, in terms of the kind of restrictions that have been placed on certain kind of immigrants. So those are the issues, and more the manner in which President Trump has articulated his political policies, which are seen as going beyond the norms in which politicians have been operating in the US. For one, for example, he has not completely divested himself from the Trump business. So that's something that presidents have not done before. And some of the manner in which he has, as they argued, brought in some of his people close to him into the administration. Again, something that had not happened before. So these are some of the policies that they feel that the norms that US leaders, US political establishment has followed in the past is not being followed today. And one major policy where they have a huge difference is related to Russia. President Trump wants to move positively with Russia, and the Democrats have been very strong with an anti-Russia policy, also introducing measures through Congress, because in their perception, Russia had intervened in the 2016 elections to help President Trump. And they feel that that's something that may be happening also in 2020.
Indeed. Professor, would you say that Trump is the one and only issue in the elections 2020? And by hitting out at Trump, would the law of diminishing returns kick in for the Democrats? The more you attack, the more stronger he gets.
Well, you know, elections are always about the unexpected. So I wouldn't say that, you know, somebody gets an advantage just because they're attacked, because the nature of politics and the nature of partisan politics is about attacking your opponent every given opportunity. So I would imagine that this is part of the game. I mean, you know, parry and thrust and fence. So the point is, as Ambassador Singh mentioned, there are issues that would come into play come November. And one of them would be geopolitical US foreign policy postures. They would gain stronger momentum in the discussions that would follow the presidential debates that are to come. And it would mean also a, while not a threadbare discussion, but there would be a definitive approach difference between the two candidates, and that would give us a better clue on whether they think Russia and China have indeed become their number one threat or number two threat, and whether that is a pan-American understanding or is it just a, you know, ploy for getting a issue onto the debate stage. So those are the issues. But I think by now we have seen the documents and the administrative machinery that works on US foreign policy has largely talked about Russia as one of the major problems in their foreign policy, which witnessed the fact that while selling sensitive and highly technical equipment to India, with a lot of bonhomie in the enabling defense trade and technology initiative, they are still saying that, look, S-400 purchased by India is not something. And the second part of this you know, dual track or a triple track that you can see in the US politics and the system right now is also that Trump likes Mr. Putin. But the rest of his administration says, no, Russians are, you know, a problem. So one has to deal with that. And the Congress has even other views. But then China is also seen as a major competitor, and China is seen as one which would, in fact, break some of the rules that has been established by the United States, particularly in Asia and Indo-Pacific, as you know. But more than anything else, the human element of Bernie Sanders being a visitor to Soviet Union, how would that play out? I mean, you know, that would also be a point that one can think about. So I'm not at this point talking so much about, say, the harsher and the more brutal politics that's going to follow after the nominations have been completed. But at this point, it is within the Democratic Party that the candidates are explaining to the party faithful, really, about whether or not their purpose and their policy and their strategies is something that you could vote for. I mean, they're really talking to the Democratic Party. And that should also be carefully crafted, because should they win the nomination, this would become a more amplified or a more sharpened posture on these issues would come out when they have to fight the Republican nominee. So, but by and large, the issues right now will be domestic in the sense of health care, which is, I think, a fundamental priority for most Americans. Because as you know, between India and the United States, we've signed one on a memorandum of understanding on mental health as well. A lot of issues are not covered in detailed analysis, but healthcare is not only expensive just in terms of access to hospitals and, you know, cures and so on, but a lot of people have chronic illness and they have no money to pay for things like massages or any of those alternative complementary integrative health systems, you know. So that's also being researched now, and the federal agencies like Veteran Affairs agencies are looking into it. So I am not at all surprised that they've signed something, because Ayurveda has a number of answers to chronic illnesses. But right now the funding is the issue, and I think most voters want to know, how will you fund this particular position you've taken on this you know, issue, and that would make a great deal of difference in choosing. And the secondary, or not secondary really, the other important thing is, can you defeat Trump? See, that defeatability and electability, I think these are two frameworks in which they will go to choose their nominee.
Indeed. I'm running out of time, so one last question to both my guests, starting with you, Ambassador Singh, regarding the foreign policy agendas of the two parties. How do the Democrats and Republicans stack up on issues of immediate concern or interest to India, namely terrorism, namely China, namely Pakistan, and namely issues internal to India?
I think there tends to be a broad similarity in their positions, some nuances of difference, and traditionally India has enjoyed bipartisan support in the US for the relationship, because they see a lot of convergence. So I think on China, for example, President Trump has come out very strongly, articulate that China is a major peer competitor. China is not following international rules and norms, and therefore there has to be a pushback on that. And you saw that also under President Obama when he spoke of pivot to Asia. On Pakistan, all US administrations, whether you look at Clinton, Bush, Obama or Trump, have sort of vacillated between at times incentivizing Pakistan, at times pressurizing Pakistan, depending on what they feel will work for them in terms of their own interests. Right now, for example, President Trump started with pressurizing, now he's incentivizing. So again, we'll have to see whichever is the US administration, to what extent do they need Pakistan in terms of their own interests, especially in Afghanistan. On terrorism, again, it has been linked to how they see the terrorist threat to themselves. So when the terrorist threat to the United States and the terrorist threat to India has some convergence, they work more together. When the convergence is not there, there may be lip service, but not the same level of working together. So I think that will be the approach, but I suspect the Democratic nominee would try and articulate that President Trump has brought down US role internationally and spoilt its relations with its allies and partners, and that's what they'll try and hit at.
All right, Professor Vijayalakshmi, you get the last word. Your thoughts on the foreign policy agendas of the Democrats and the Republicans on issues such as China, Pakistan and terrorism?
Well, I think I broadly agree that there has been a degree of bipartisan support to India-US relations, which we have been very happy to see and to encourage. And I think beyond administrations, there have been a definitive understanding of a pan-American kind on China as a peer competitor. You do see them now pressurizing us on digital dialogue, which is also to deal with 5G and Huawei and all of that. And I think that's part of that. But the essence of the argument is that it is a pan-American thinking. And therefore, both Democrats and Republicans may differ on how to deal with this problem, but they will not, they have not differed on that it is a problem. China is a problem and a concern. The second thing is also about gathering more support rather than just a voluntary coalition of the willing to a more nuanced and principled, for example, Indo-Pacific joint statement. For example, we did see that during Clinton time, it was a kind of new equation building 5 pillars on which we could have a new, improved and a strong Indo-US relations. During Bush's time, it was also characterized by not only encouraging this trend, but we went to a strategic partnership, but we also found a dehyphenation between India and Pakistan. And from dehyphenation and moving towards a strategic partnership, we got the nuclear deal. But then came Mr. Obama, and we found that not only had the strategic dialogue and partnership partnership issues improved because he called it a defining partnership of the 21st century. So there was this idea of a shared future, and at the same time, exhibited some jointness in the joint statement on the Indo-Pacific. Despite the fact that we did have some differences in terms of what constitutes the Indo-Pacific.